Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful sponsor webinar. I'm here with Rhonda Douglas with Resilient Writers, and she's going to be talking to us today about how to structure your memoir. So this is a great topic. I know we have a lot of memoirists in our community, so I know that many of you are probably really looking forward to this topic. So I'm going to introduce Rhonda quickly and then let her dive right in. So, Rhonda is the host of the Resilient Writers radio show and the creator of the First Book Finish program. An award winning poet and fiction author, she lives in Ottawa, Canada, with her Cocker Spaniel, Mr. Darcy. Rhonda, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Mr. Darcy is just snoring on the couch. So if you hear sort of, something that sounds like thunder in the background, that would be him.
That's great.
All right. Well, I have a presentation that I'm going to give on structuring structure for memoir, and then I will stop and take some questions. And you can feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. And they can be questions about the presentation, but they can also just be questions about something you've been wondering about your own memoir, okay? So let me get going here. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Looks good.
Great. So we're talking today about how to choose your memoir structure. This is something that comes up all the time. I work with quite a few memoirists, and particularly in my first book finish program. And, this idea of structure is probably, I would say, the most pressing question that memoirists have. And it has to do with, what is included in the book, and then how do I put the book together? So let's just dive in. I want to invite you to turn off all distractions. So if you're like me and you have 25 different tabs open on the computer, maybe shut those down, turn off the phone, put it in another room, put it on silent, whatever you need to do to give yourself this time to dedicate just to thinking about your memoir. So here's a quote from William Zinzer. Memoir isn't the summary of a life. It's a window into a life, very much like a photograph in its selective composition. It may look like a casual and even random calling up of bygone events. It's not, it's a deliberative construction. I think this idea of selective composition is really important. One of the biggest questions for memoir is what do I leave in, and where do I draw the line, basically. So I like to go back and just start with what are our goals, because in the current publishing environment, your goals need to define what you do. Okay? So, for example, what's your hope for this book? Like, if you want a big 5 publishing deal and bestseller status, like, let me just, Tara Westover's Educated, for example, your memoir needs to read like a best-selling novel. That's just the reality of it. You probably also need a fairly significant author platform. If you're going to go with a smaller independent press, and I love the small independent presses, these are sometimes called the literary presses, but they are more experimental, and so they're interested in form, and you have a lot more choice in your structure. And if you're sharing, you're like, I just want to get this down to share it with family and friends. You still want to keep your reader in mind, but you can please yourself in terms of structure, right? Especially if you're going to self-publish. You've got a lot more flexibility. So it needs to begin, your structure of your memoir needs to begin with your goals for your book, okay? This is true of fiction, but it's very true of memoir, okay? The next thing you want to do is you really want to get clear on theme. Theme with memoir. So memoir is not autobiography, right? There are some autobiographies out there, and Memoir is not like the whole story of your life. It's a slice of your life. It's a selective part of your life. And thinking about it thematically really helps. So, for example, you want to choose a theme that is not too broad. And it's your theme that helps determine what goes into the book and what doesn't. So, for example, in my first book finish program, I'm working with a woman who is writing a memoir about surviving a marriage with a narcissist. And she's so obviously it begins with just before she met him and then goes through their relationship up until they got married, what happened after. It's a marriage that has some abuse in it, and until the dissolution of the marriage. She can put in some things, and she has put in some things about her parents and her relationship with her parents because it's important background for why she got involved with that person in the first place, right? But she doesn't have to get into a big, long explanation of what her childhood was like, right? Because that's not pertinent to this theme. So, the other thing I like to encourage memoirists to do is to choose a date, like to decide the book begins here and it ends here. Okay? So, theme and ideally a date to kind of give it some structure, because otherwise you're going to find yourself wondering, oh, but wait, this other thing is kind of sort of related. Should I include it? But if you have a date of when the story begins and when the story ends, that and the theme that you choose really helps you narrow down the book. Because the biggest question with memoir is, should I include this and this and this and this, right? Because when we think about our lives often feel very interconnected. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about narrative structure. So narrative structure, it's not the events themselves, it's how those events are arranged to tell the story. You can use common narrative structures to also structure your memoir. I teach something in my first book finish program called the Essential Book Outline, which is making sure that your book follows the fundamentals of story. But you could write a memoir the same way we do, Save the Cat writes a novel. You can write a memoir that uses the hero's journey or the heroine's journey or the virgin's promise or story genius. The difference is you're thinking about your earlier self that went through whatever it is you're writing the memoir about. That person is the protagonist, and your older, wiser self, now on the other end of that experience, is the narrator. Okay? Does that make sense? And then we arrange the events in a certain order. I'm going to talk about that. So there are 5 basic structures, and then there's a few extras that I'll talk about that are a little more experimental, a little more literary. The 5 basic structures for memoir are chronological, and then you also have the dramatic scene and then chronological. So in the chronological, we begin at the beginning and we go to the end. So it's beginning, middle, end. And you can think of that in the classic Act 3 structure, right? Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And it's just chronological. And in a chronological story, the reader has the sense that something is going to happen and they're waiting for the thing to happen. Okay? They have a promise, you think about the blurb on the back of the book, and they're waiting for the story to unfold. In the second one, the dramatic scene and then chronological, so I think of this as like drama plus chronological, there's the big moment, like whatever the moment is. So let's say someone is writing an addiction story and they end up arrested. That big, like, moment they get arrested and go to jail would be like the first scene, and then it's chronological. And now the reader is wondering, they kind of enter the book going, whoa, how did we get here? Okay. You can also do reverse chronological. Reverse chronological is, starting at the end and going backwards. And then you have the reader wondering, okay, we're here at this situation. How did that develop? The other one you can do is intersecting timelines. So this is where you have two different timelines and they kind of at some point meet or cross over. And then we have the layered or fragmented memoir. This is a little more literary, but this would include, for example, the memoir in a series of essays, or a series of fragments, or a series of, just kind of layered scenes. Okay, so these are the 5 different structures. Let's talk about each of them. So why would you choose a chronological structure? A chronological structure helps you write a book that reads most like a novel. It's very straightforward, it's very familiar to readers, and it allows you to tell the story as it happened in real time. And, and you're revealing, as the narrator, you're revealing what you did or didn't know or understand at the time. So my best example of a chronological type of memoir would be Educated by Tara Westover. I'm sure most people are familiar with that. Big, best-selling memoir from a few years back. And she tells the story chronologically, right? From her childhood to when she ends up in university, and how her relationship with her family and her parents changes over that time as she grows and evolves. The second one is a big dramatic story and then chronological. So why would you choose a structure where you start with a dramatic scene and then go back to chronological? This one can also read like a novel. It's fairly straightforward. Readers can dive right in. They feel familiar. And they're captivated by trying to understand how the story happened and what led up to the dramatic scene shared at the start. So in Wild by Cheryl Strayed, her mom has died, right? And so she decides to hike the trail. And then you have the story of the trail, what happens to her on the trail, and how she begins to understand the choices she's made in her own life through her time on the trail, right? Reverse chronological. So this is a structure that goes backwards in time. It can be hard to pull off. I think if your structure really has like a big dramatic moment, so just as an example, an addiction memoir where someone gets arrested and ends up in jail and has a lot of interesting events and character development that kind of leads into that moment, then I think reverse chronological can work. Because what's happening for the reader is thinking, whoa, how did we end up here? What is going on? So an example of a memoir that uses reverse chronological structure would be Men We Reaped by Jesmyn Ward. I love pretty much everything Jesmyn Ward has ever done, and highly recommend this memoir if you're thinking about reverse chronological. Big dramatic moment and then going backwards in time to see how that came to pass. Intersecting timelines. Okay. If you want the reader to see the differences between now and then. And so you're kind of putting these two timelines in parallel with each other. And if there are hidden secrets or connections to be uncovered between the past and the present, this structure can really work. And a good example of this one would be Between Two Kingdoms, another best-selling memoir in the last couple of years by Suleika Jawad. So that's really another one worth reading if you're thinking about intersecting timelines. So are there secrets or connections between the past and the present? In that case, you might want to look at something that's got like a timeline for before and a timeline for now, and looking at how these intersect. Then we have the layered or fragmented. This is a little, I would say this is a little more, on the literary side. And what happens when a structure is layered or fragmented is that meaning accretes. So you have scene, 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 maybe some reflections, and they're in pieces. So these might be a memoir, an essay, for example. And what happens is, as this happens, as the scenes unfold, it's like the reader is walking deeper and deeper into the story and has a deeper and deeper understanding of your story, okay? And so I would recommend In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado as an example of a layered or fragmented kind of structure. There certainly are others, but I would recommend this one. We need to be reading in our genre. In part because if you're going to pursue traditional publishing, you'll need to have what are known as comps, which are comparable books to refer to. But even without that, let's say you're going to go hybrid or you're going to self-publish, you still want to know what's happening in your genre. And so I do recommend these in particular, and you may have already read many of these. Educated and Wild are a little older, so they've been out for a while, and then the others are a little more recent. But they're just worth reading to notice what the author is doing. So in this case, you're reading like a writer. You're trying to understand how is it that the author has done this, right? Okay. The more that you want a traditional book deal, you want a big 5 publisher, you want to pitch an agent and get them to take on. So I'm working with someone right now in First Book Finish. She has this amazing story about being drawn back into her ex's family during a crisis, and they discover a whole bunch of high value items that eventually get sold at auction at Sotheby's. And it's also about mental health, and it's about, family dynamics and all the things that go into it. And she's interested in a traditional book deal. And so her book has to read like a novel. So the more you want a traditional book deal, the more you should stick with the structures that are already selling well. So you should be in your bookstore and in your library looking at what are the current best-selling memoirs and how are they structured. That's a clue for how yours needs to be structured. Now, are there other structures than these main 5? Yes. So there are memoirs made of lyric poetry and prose poetry. Memoir in verse is increasingly something that's happening. And there are other experimental forms, including some not yet written. I have one here somewhere where the author wrote the book in segments and put them in a box, and you can read them in any order, right? That's a very experimental form. So you just have to kind of know, excuse me, you just have to know where you fit in the marketplace and what structure feels like it will allow you to most effectively tell your story. So I like to think of this as the memoir process. First, we start with goals, right? Do I want to be traditionally published? Am I just getting it out into the world for family and friends? Am I somewhere in between? Am I going to do a literary press, right? And then I choose my theme, and ideally a date, a beginning date and end date. I think about structure, and then I dive in and I finish the rough draft. I revise, I get feedback, beta readers, a developmental editor, manuscript review, however you decide to go about that. And then you revise again, and then you edit. So I distinguish between revision and editing. I don't believe that we write a draft and then we open chapter one and we start tweaking the language. Revision is about revisioning the story. It's about structure, it's about character development, and that includes your development as the protagonist of your own story. Okay? I do believe that we need your story. I think people come to stories for so many different reasons. If you're a reader, I read about 3 to 5 books a week, and I read memoir. I love memoir. And we read in order to not be alone with what we're dealing with. So I was doing an interview on the podcast for a woman whose memoir I edited. Her name is Bonnie Woodland, and she wrote a book about being in a cult and then being in an abusive relationship because of being in a cult and how she got out of it. And it's a fascinating story. She self-published, but it's a fascinating story, right? And at the back, she put a whole bunch of resources for people who might find themselves in an abusive relationship or in a cult and need to understand how to get out of it. And so for her, it was really important to write that book to help others feel not so alone. So I believe the world needs the story that only you can write. Okay, I want to share something with you. I'm going to stop sharing so I can get this in the chat here. Let me grab this. I do have a handout for you. I'll put it in the chat. This is how you can sign up for this. It is the 15 essential scenes every memoir needs. Okay? Let me run through that for you now. I'm just going to pull it up. Oh gosh. Sorry, I thought I had it in front of me. Here it is. I'll share my screen again. So, okay, can you see this? So this is what you'll get if you decide to sign up for that. I will say when you sign up for this, you're also on my email list. I do send out a podcast every single week on Fridays. I'm also doing a free summit for writers, the Book Finisher Summit at the end of June. So you'll hear all about that as well. So these are the 15 scenes every memoir needs. And so let's just the scene that starts in the middle, right? It doesn't begin at the beginning of your life. And so we need to be dropped into a specific, vivid scene from the story you're telling. And then we kind of get to know the world and sense that something's already in motion. And it's really important as writers, whether you're writing memoir or fiction, that we understand how to write a good scene. And we let our scenes do the work, okay? Then there's kind of the world before, right? This is a grounded scene that establishes what life was like before the thing that happened. It's not like a whole summary of your childhood. It's one specific moment. So it might be, you're in the kitchen baking with your mom. And then, I don't know, maybe your parents get divorced and it kind of triggers a whole family dynamic or whatever. The wound or the hunger. So this is about the deeper why beneath the surface story. So it's about the longing that drove you, the question you didn't even know you were answering, the wound that you carried, and it roots your story in emotional truth. So, and you want to show it in scene, through behavior, through choice, through avoiding something, okay? Then we have that moment. This is what could be, in a novel, this would be the inciting incident. It's when something happens. An arrival, a diagnosis, a decision, a loss. And it sets up the memoir's central experience, right? Life as it was before isn't possible And so it really answers the question, what's this memoir actually about? So the shift should feel like something happens in the external world, but something in you happens as well as a result of the external. Okay? So both of those matter. You also want the first attempt to cope. So this will be, it's often where flaws or blind spots or coping patterns are most visible. And it's that first attempt, right? So, in an example of a memoir, that is, so I've got someone in first book finish right now. She was bipolar and then has just recently had an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and she's writing her memoir, both of being bipolar, but her story starts with her Alzheimer's diagnosis. And so there's always that moment right after a diagnosis of how we try to figure out how to cope, right? Then there's the relationship that holds the mirror. So this is a scene with someone. It can be an ally, it can be a romantic partner, it can be an adversary, a witness, it can even be a stranger that reflects something about you that you can't see yourself. People in your story carry meaning, and so it just deepens character and theme. And so ideally, this is the kind of thing where a relationship is complicated. And of course, in memoir, they often are, right? Then we have the scene you didn't want to write. This is the biggest. So I just want to talk about the contract with the reader for memoir. When a reader picks up a memoir, they believe that the author is being entirely truthful and accurate to the extent that memory allows. Memory is a very mutable thing at times, right? But to the extent that memory allows, you are being truthful and accurate, and you are being vulnerable. You cannot write a good memoir and leave some of the story off the page. Leave the part that you feel ashamed of or embarrassed about. And so the one that scares you most is probably the one that is going to transform your reader on the other end, where they're going to feel seen and understood and not so alone in their own struggle because you were brave enough to put it on the page. Then we have the midpoint revelation. This is in the middle. Something about yourself, another person, or the situation you're in that reframes what came before. So it's about maybe you learn a secret that helps you understand what was going on in your parents' marriage, for example. Okay? So it's, you don't want the middle of your novel to just be like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Ideally, memoir. You don't just want it to be like a collection of events. You want it to be events that have meaning. And so thinking about what's a scene where I suddenly reframed everything for myself. And if you read a lot of memoir, you'll see where this happens, right? There are definitely scenes, if I think of Wild by Cheryl Strayed, there are definitely scenes where that happens, right? And then we have where the cost becomes clear, what the experience is taking from you. It raises the stakes. It makes the reader understand why the story matters. And you want this to be in scene. A moment when you noticed what that experience cost you, right? Maybe you went through a divorce. So thinking again about this memoir where someone is surviving a marriage with a narcissist, maybe you kind of have a moment where you realize, I really just lost who I was, and show us that in scene. Then there's the confrontation or the breaking point, and this is direct conflict. Can be with a system, old choices, your circumstances, but something really comes to a head here, and it's like the beginning of the end of who you used to be. You want it to be specific and embodied. We want to feel in you what this confrontation or this conflict cost you. And we want to feel it. You want to write a scene that allows us to feel it in your body as you know, so you are the protagonist in your memoir, right? So, let's say you had a scene where you had a big blow up with your mother and decided to cut her out of your life. We need to feel how that felt in your body. Okay. And then we have the dark night of the soul. This is the lowest point where it seems like all is lost, right? It's the most vulnerable scene in the book, and it's important. Stay in the body, the moment, let the reader feel it through the scene. Unexpected grace. This is often a part of memoir, right? Where we have a realization, or someone does something, or a small crack opens in the darkness. It's a turning point. It's not a rescue, but it changes the direction of the story. And you want that grace to feel earned. It comes from somewhere, maybe something you've been avoiding, and now you see it. Maybe someone that shows up to help you, right? There's the choice that changes everything. So after this, you do something different than you would have been at the beginning. In the end, all stories are about change. We have who you were at the beginning of your memoir, and we have who you are at the end. And if you are not different, what you have is an anecdote and not a story. So you want this to be shown in scene, and it's basically proof of your character arc as the protagonist. You have the scene of reckoning. This is where you face the full truth. Maybe these are big moments with, a big scene with family, or a scene in a courtroom, or anything like that. It's not necessarily something that is resolving, but it's where the writer looks clearly at their own story and tells the truth about what's really been going on. And then we have the new ground, right? A final scene that shows us who you are now. Not through summary. So what I see, the most common issue with memoir is people go through something, and while they're going through it, they write a lot of journal entries. And then they try to turn those journal entries into memoir. And so they're writing reflections, thinking about the thing that happened. I don't want you to do that here. I want you to show us the thing that happened. Okay? And it needs to be in scene. When you want your reader to feel something, you want to put things in scene. Okay? So I'm going to, that's what I have. I will, if you want to sign up for the 15 essential scenes and get that in your inbox, you can sign up there. Shelley, the free summit is happening in June, so I think I'm starting to promote it sort of around the 10th of June. So if you're on my email list, you sign up for that, then you will get it. Erica's saying, I'm immediately thinking of Mary Carr's Liar Club, which is such a fantastic example of the drama and chrono structure. Yes, that's a really good example as well. So good. Okay, let's do let's do some questions. Erica's saying, what are your thoughts about presenting a collection of slices from different times throughout your life that support the memoir's theme? So I think that can really work, Erica. I think that's that layered or fragmented structure, right? So what you need to be careful of there is making sure that every slice, every fragment speaks directly or indirectly but clearly to the theme. One of the challenges of memoir is kind of not knowing what to include and what not to include. And we want to include the things that are most relevant and not get drawn down a path of let me also include this because it's sort of kind of relevant, right? So, but I think that fragmented, layered thing is very popular these days. It's more popular at the literary presses, I would say. Even Carmen Maria Machado's memoir that I gave as the example for that, in the Dream House, that was published with a literary press. And so if that's the kind of memoir you're writing, I would recommend a literary press. Do you have any insights in writing memoirs for children? I am 75. Susan. I feel like I would need to know more about this, but I'm assuming you're writing a memoir that you want maybe your grandchildren to read or something. It basically comes down, it's the same story, but it's edited and it uses language that children can understand. And you probably will want to make some choices about what does and doesn't get included. Like if I was writing a memoir that I wanted my grandson to read, he's only 3, but let's say he's 12 or 15 or 20, and I'm writing a memoir that I want my grandson to read, I don't know that I would put in it, for example, experiences of sexual assault that I had. I might, but I might not, right? So writing for children, you are writing material that's suitable for children in language that children can understand. That's all, right? Would the sequence of the 15 essential scenes vary in a different narrative structures? Marjorie, that's such a good question. So yes, in the different structures, they would vary. So a memoir needs all of those scenes, and that's just 15 scenes. Your memoir might have 25, 35, 50 scenes, right? And so maybe it has scenes that are deepening relationships, deepening an understanding of the setting and the context in which this all happened. And then structure is all really about sequence. It's about the order in which the events happen. And so depending on the structure that you choose, the scenes in your memoir will vary, okay? Can I give an example of memoir in verse? I don't think I can think of one off the top of my head, Jennifer. I can think of novels in verse. I know someone who's writing one in verse right now in my First Book Finish program, but I don't have an example of one to give you that's published. Memoir in verse is highly literary, right? It's highly literary. It's not the kind of thing that's likely to take off with a big commercial press. Sandra says, my draft is from essays I wrote in the moment over a 10-year period. I've had difficulty bridging the gap between some essays or scenes without resorting to narrative. How can I preserve the immediacy of the moment and still take the reader forward smoothly? This is a really good question, Sandra. You've said without resorting to narrative. And I think a good memoir resorts to narrative. There is a place for the reflective voice of the older, wiser narrative in memoir, right? But we want to see what happened as a reader. We want to see what happened. And so most of your memoir needs to be written in scene. And that's how you get across the immediacy of the moments. Not from writing, I thought this and I thought that and then I kind of felt this, but from showing it in scene. Okay? I don't know if you guys have read the memoir Heavy. I'm going to forget who wrote it now. It's a award-winning memoir. Beautiful. And thank you, Marjorie. Marjorie's put a verse memoir list from Goodreads in the chat. And it's a hard memoir to read. It's sort of it talks about why he became the man he did, and there's sexual abuse in it. So it can be hard to read, um, but it's so beautifully immediate, and it really makes you feel exactly what he was going through. And it's because it reads like a novel. It's true, but he's written it in scene. Diana's saying, I'm wondering how historical accuracy is necessary when writing about past events. I'm writing about my mother, sharecropper's daughter, her life between the dash. Format is in the form of letters she may have written to her mom and then her sister. So I was working with someone on a memoir, Diane, um, where during COVID, her mother was dying and she went home to Scotland to care for her. And her mother was an amazing storyteller and was telling her these stories. So the memoir kind of has these three threads. It has the stories, and it has some imagined stories from her mother's earlier life based on what she knew, but these are fictionalized. And then it has the reflections of the writer herself. So you can do some things that kind of, bridge genres. Um, and certainly in epistolary, the form of letters. Um, when you're writing letters she may have written to her mom and then her sister, unless you have the actual letters themselves, then you are fictionalizing by default, unless you are looking at an actual letter. So you might want to think about moving away from memoir and into autobiographical fiction, right? Which is fiction, so it allows you to make up things, but it draws on real life characters. And then you don't have to worry about historical accuracy, because letters someone may have written are, in their very nature, fiction. I hope that helps. Susan says, I'm writing for my 5-year-old niece Sophie, and more as she gets older. Do you have any resources for correct reading levels for children? Sophie at 5 is a picture book kid, right? So it's illustrated with a small amount of text. Then as she gets older, it's chapter books with more text, but maybe still some illustrations. And then as she becomes a teenager, it's all text. So I don't have any direct resources to suggest, Susan, but a good Google search will get you that, okay? Developmental editors who work with memoir. Ooh. Gosh. I work with memoir quite a bit, and I don't do a developmental edit, I do manuscript reviews. So that means you send me a book that you have drafted, maybe you've done a bit of revision on it, and I read it through twice, and then I write you an editorial note that shows you what's already working, because that's important. You don't want to screw up what's already working, right, as you revise, and then what you can do to further strengthen the book. And then we get on a call and we talk that through. So I do that with memoir. Janelle Hardy is someone who works a lot with memoir. I don't know if she's taking developmental editing clients at the moment, but you can find her online. I'll put her name in the chat here. Nicole Brait is someone else, and a woman in Australia, if any of you are south, Vanessa Barrington, the book doula. There's all kinds. You can also look on Readsy, but I would look to get a referral, because one of the challenges of finding an editor, you go on Readsy, or you go Googling and you find some people you just don't even necessarily know. And so, and you don't want to pay money and have them. I have had experiences from my first book finished students where they've gone off and hired a developmental editor and paid them up front, and then they wait months and months and months to get the book. So it's something you want to be careful about. So I would ask for a referral. What structure would you recommend for the life growing up as a PK, preacher's kid? Is that what that is? Shaped who I am today. There will be dramatic scenes such as suicide, etc. I would do the dramatic scene, the most dramatic scene at the front, and then I would do chronological, because I think that would make the most of the material that you've got. Yeah. Andrew's saying, if the event or challenge that drives the memoir affects multiple relationships similarly, how do you select which ones to include? If I was writing something for a traditional book deal, Andrew, I would go with the most dramatic scenes. So I would think about relationships, but I would think about the scenes that illustrate those relationships and how the dynamic was unfolding in those relationships. And I wouldn't try to include every relationship. When you're writing a memoir, you're usually writing it because you have something to say about the experience that you had, right? And so ask yourself, what is it I really want to leave the reader with? When the reader picks up my memoir and puts it down, what's the overriding thing I want to leave them with? What's the thematic statement that I want to leave them with? And then I would select the relationships and the scenes that illustrate those relationships the best. Okay? I think we've done them all in the chat, have we? Yes, I think we have. I'll just double check I haven't missed anything here. Jennifer has put a link to the Northwest Editors Guilds. There's all kinds of editors guilds around, and I really agree with Erica about compatible personalities. And also, I think you have to know that that editor understands memoir. You really have to know that they get it, that they're not trying to get you to somehow twist your story in a way that doesn't suit memoir. Diane was saying, I was wondering if an autobiography would be more the genre. I do not have the letters, just her stories. Some pretty heart-wrenching, as she was the only daughter of 4 that left the Deep South to follow her husband to Oregon during World War II. If you don't have the letters, it's also not autobiography. Autobiography is based on historical fact. If you don't have the letters, I would go with autobiographical fiction, because you're going to be making up the letters. And once you make things up, you're no longer in the realm of autobiography, or in this case, biography, because you're writing about someone else. And so I would go with autobiographical fiction or biographical fiction. What about an illness memoir, long COVID, and ME CFS? 20 years to be diagnosed, misdiagnosis, medical trauma, finding community and acceptance. How to write this so it's acceptable to a publisher. I have worked with quite a few folks who, in First Book Finish, who are working on what I would call, an illness memoir. And often with misdiagnosis and, a real struggle within the medical community and looking for other solutions. So, you want to make sure that the illness itself, the misdiagnosis, the medical trauma, community acceptance, all of that is written in scene. It's not you thinking about it, it's written in scene so that we're reading it as though we're there. So you say medical trauma. I'm reading that as though I'm in the emergency room with you right then and there, seeing what's happening. Okay? And that goes for everything. And that's the way to really think about writing that, but it's got to be in scene. Elizabeth is asking, is it okay to spread out from age 14 to 40? I'm 80 now. It's about my search for self-esteem, but I didn't know that for a long time. Yeah, you can bridge that 14 to 40. I would take a scene at 14 that really highlights who you were then, and a scene at 40 that highlights who you were then, and have those as the anchor scenes, and then fill in between using the 15 essential scenes as a guide. Okay, Elizabeth? Hopefully that helps. A lot of what I want to write is scary for me as a former foster child. I like your slow, kind process. It doesn't frighten me. Thank you for saying that. How to contact me. I actually had a slide for that. So I am at Resilient Writers. So I'm at Resilient Writers on Instagram. If you're on Facebook, it's facebook.com/The Resilient Writer. And my website is resilientwriters.com. And yeah, you can reach me all of those ways. Okay. And I'd love to hear from you. Diane raised her hand. Diane, is there something you wanted to say? Did we cover what you needed? I don't know if you can come off mute. Where's Diane? There's Diane. Diane?
Yeah, I just hit the wrong button.
No worries. Oh, you hit the wrong button. Zoom.
I'm moving a cat, okay? But
Okay,
I am sending another note.
Okay. All right, good.
I
Hi,
love this
Deborah.
thing.
Hi, I see Deborah Taylor's here. Hey. Hey, everyone. So that's how you can reach me, and I'd love to hear from you. My email, I'll put it in the chat. I'm Rhonda at Resilient Writers. Writers.com. Okay. Oh, I do want to say something else actually for the person who said that she's writing things that are scary for her. So I'm working with someone right now writing a memoir about the death of her child. It's hard. It's kind of triggering for her. And so I recommend extreme self-care for memoir writers who are kind of still triggered by their own material, right? And so that means instead of sitting down to write for 2 hours, you write for 20 minutes and then you go for a walk to regulate your nervous system. And you do a lot of nervous system regulation work. It might be a warm bath, it might be going for a walk, it might be getting a hug from a loved one to make sure that you are taking care of yourself as you are doing the writing. Okay? Okay, I think that's it.
It looks like we have one more question that was
Oh,
just
you have
put
one
into
more?
the Q&A box.
Jennifer says, my memoir is about residential treatment for heroin addiction in the 1980s when Phoenix House was treating addicts in Orange County. It includes my story and the director of Phoenix House who flew out there from New York. It touches on race. Is there a place for this type of story? Jennifer, yes. So not just because it's an addiction story, but the racial component honestly makes it a like profoundly necessary story for today, and a story that agents and the traditional publishing world would be interested in seeing. Yeah, it is easy to get depressed writing about hard stuff. You have to take care of yourself as you are as you are. It can be the same for fiction, but especially autobiographical fiction where you're drawing on your own life. But when you are writing memoir, you sometimes don't realize until you are writing the scene that you've just done something to trigger yourself, and now you're out of, your nervous system is all just dysregulated. And so really thinking about, what does extreme self-care need to look like for me as I am writing my memoir, so that I don't end up leaving myself in a worse emotional and mental state. um, Anna's saying, are publishers interested in illness memoirs, or is they seen as a downer? Pretty much every memoir I've ever read could be seen as a downer. Because they tend to be about, particularly in the traditional publishing world, they tend to be fairly dramatic in order to warrant that commercial treatment. So I think they definitely are interested. You might have, depending on the nature of the memoir, you might have better luck with a small independent press. And what I love about the small independent press, they make good books, and people there really care about books. So they're putting you up for awards, they're suggesting you for festivals. They really go out of their way to make the most of it. So you might want to think about that. But otherwise, if you have an illness memoir, um, it really would depend on the nature of the memoir as to whether or not it was for traditional publishing or not. But I wouldn't let the fact that something isn't sexy enough for traditional publishing stop you from writing your memoir. I think there's a lot of space. Erica, you'd have to Google that. It's really different. You know, um, I would listen to the podcast. I'm going to find it for you. Just give me a sec. Give me a sec. Um, let's talk memoir. So it's by Ronit Plank. I adore Ronit. I think she's amazing. And this is her podcast. And she interviews memoirists talking about the process for writing memoir. And so, what I would do is I would look at the people that have published um, the books for the authors that she is promoting, because most of them will be small presses. Okay. And all presses are helpful and supportive of new authors once you're in there. That's my experience and the experience of the students that I have. I've got someone right now just got a thriller, first a horror and then a thriller accepted. She's loving her press, and it's a smaller press. Okay. All right, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. I hope it was helpful. Um, do download the 15 essential scenes, and good luck with your books. I'm looking forward to seeing them on the bookshelf.
Thank you so much for being with us, Rhonda. Everyone, please check out her website and get to know more about resilient writers.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.